He was a decorated soldier who gave everything for his country, but when the war ended, he was thrown away like broken equipment, until the night he crawled into an abandoned bunker to escape the cold and stumbled upon a secret that would shake the entire nation. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind cut through Marcus Cole like a blade that night, slicing through the threadbare army jacket he'd worn since his discharge 4 years ago. Montana winters don't forgive, and this one seemed determined to remind him exactly how little the world cared whether he lived or died. He pulled the collar tighter around his neck, but it didn't matter. The cold had already settled into his bones, into the shrapnel scars that ran along his left side, into the knee that hadn't worked right since Kandahar. He was 42 years old, 3 combat tours, a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and not a single place on earth to call home. The town of Ridgecrest sprawled below him in the valley, its lights flickering like dying stars against the black Montana night. Population 800 and something, depending on who'd left that month and who'd bothered to stay. It was the kind of town that time forgot and progress ignored, a collection of weathered storefronts and pickup trucks and people who minded their own business a little too well. Marcus had drifted into Ridgecrest 6 months ago, following the railroad tracks from Billings after the shelter there filled up and the streets became too crowded with men just like him. Men who'd seen things. Men who couldn't unsee them. Men who'd been promised everything and handed nothing but a folded flag and a thank you for your service that meant less than the paper their discharge papers were printed on. He'd tried, God knows he'd tried, to build something after the army. But the headaches came first, then the nightmares. Then the days when he couldn't leave whatever room he was renting because the walls felt safer than the open sky. Employers don't understand why a grown man flinches at car backfires. Landlords don't care about service records when the rent's 3 months late. Family gets tired of phone calls at 2 in the morning from someone who can't stop seeing his best friend's face the moment before the IID turned him into memory. So Marcus walked. That's what he did now. He walked and he survived, and he tried not to think too much about the fact that surviving was all he had left. Tonight, though, the cold was different. The radio at the gas station had warned about it for days, an Arctic front pushing down from Canada, temperatures dropping to 15 below, wind chill making it feel like 30 below. The kind of cold that killed homeless men in their sleep. The kind of cold that didn't care about Bronze Stars or combat tours or anything else. Marcus needed shelter, real shelter, not the usual spots behind the hardware store or under the bridge by Miller Creek. Those wouldn't cut it tonight. He'd freeze before dawn, and they'd find him stiff as a board, another statistic, another veteran who fell through the cracks. He'd heard stories about the old bunker in the hills east of town. Cold War relic, the locals said. Built back in the 60s when everyone thought the Russians were going to drop the bomb any day. Supposedly abandoned for decades, sealed up and forgotten like so many things from that era. Kids used to dare each other to find it, but most of the trails had grown over, and nobody really remembered exactly where it was anymore. Marcus remembered. He'd spotted it 3 weeks ago while foraging for firewood in the forest, a concrete structure half swallowed by the hillside, its entrance choked with dead brush and rusted metal. At the time, he'd noted it the way soldiers note everything: potential cover, defensible position, possible shelter. He hadn't needed it then. He needed it now. The hike took nearly 2 hours in the dark. His bad legs screamed with every step, the old injury flaring like fire beneath his skin. He'd taken shrapnel to that knee in 2011, a routine patrol that turned into anything but routine when the convoy hit a pressure plate. The blast killed 2 of his men instantly. Marcus survived, but part of him had stayed behind on that dusty road, bleeding out alongside brothers whose names he still whispered in his sleep. The VA had promised surgery, then delayed it, then lost his paperwork, then told him he'd have to start the whole process over again. That was 3 years ago. He'd stopped trying after that. The trees grew thicker as he climbed, their bare branches scratching against the night sky like skeletal fingers. The moon hung low and pale, offering just enough light to see the path ahead. His breath came in white clouds that vanished almost instantly in the bitter air. Finally, he saw it. The bunker emerged from the hillside like a forgotten tomb, its concrete face cracked and stained with decades of weathering. The entrance was maybe 6 feet wide, sealed with a rusted metal door that hung slightly askew on its hinges. Government markings had once been painted on the surface, but time had worn them down to faint shadows, barely visible in the moonlight. Marcus approached carefully, his instincts still sharp despite everything. He checked the perimeter, looked for signs of recent activity, listened for any sound that didn't belong to the wind. Nothing. The place was dead, abandoned, exactly what he needed. The door groaned in protest when he pulled it, the sound echoing through the frozen forest like a wounded animal. Inside, darkness swallowed everything. Marcus pulled out his lighter, a battered Zippo he'd carried since basic training, and flicked it to life. The flame revealed a concrete corridor stretching maybe 20 feet into the hillside, ending at another door, this one solid steel and surprisingly intact. The walls were lined with old conduit pipes and faded warning signs. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed. Nobody had been here in years, maybe decades. Marcus pulled the outer door shut behind him, and immediately the wind's howl faded to a whisper. The temperature wasn't warm by any means, but it was shelter. It was something between him and the killing cold outside. He made his way to the inner door and found it unlocked, the handle turning with a reluctant creak. Beyond it, a larger space opened up, some kind of operations room from the look of it. Old desks sat against the walls, their surfaces covered in debris. Filing cabinets stood in rows, their drawers hanging open and empty. A map of the United States hung crooked on one wall, yellowed and torn. It was a time capsule frozen in the 1960s, waiting for a nuclear war that never came. Marcus set down his rucksack and began to clear a space in the corner, pushing aside debris and checking for anything that might be useful. The concrete floor was cold but not freezing. The walls blocked the wind entirely. With his sleeping bag and the 2 blankets he carried, he might actually survive the night. He worked methodically, the way the army had taught him. Secure the perimeter, establish a base of operations, assess resources. The routine calmed him, gave his mind something to focus on besides the cold and the pain and the voice in his head that sometimes whispered he should have died in Kandahar with the others. By the time he'd set up his sleeping area, his fingers were numb and his leg had stiffened to the point where he could barely bend it. He lowered himself onto the sleeping bag with a grunt, pulling the blankets around his shoulders. Tomorrow he'd explore more, see what else this place might offer. Tonight, he just needed to survive. Marcus closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. He woke to silence and the pale grey light of dawn filtering through cracks in the outer door. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The disorientation that had plagued him since his discharge, that constant feeling of being between worlds, never quite belonging anywhere. Then it came back. The bunker, the cold, the desperate hike through the forest. He sat up slowly, his body protesting every movement. The temperature had dropped even further during the night, but he was alive. That counted for something. Marcus pulled a protein bar from his rucksack, his last one, and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. Food was getting harder to come by. The churches in Ridgecrest did what they could, but their resources were limited, and there were more hungry mouths than helping hands. He'd learned to stretch what he had, to ignore the gnawing in his stomach, to function on less than any civilian would consider survivable. The army had taught him that too. When he'd finished eating, he stood and began to explore his new shelter in earnest. The main room was larger than he'd realized in the dark, maybe 30 feet by 20, with a low ceiling that made him feel slightly claustrophobic. Besides the desks and filing cabinets, there were several metal lockers along one wall, most of them rusted shut. He pried one open and found a treasure trove of supplies. Old wool blankets still sealed in plastic, canned goods with dates from 1963, a first aid kit, even a few bottles of water that had miraculously remained sealed. The cans were probably no good after 60 years, but the blankets were a godsend, and the first aid kit contained bandages and antiseptic that didn't expire. Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: luck. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in months. He continued exploring, finding a small bathroom with a toilet that obviously didn't work, and a sink that produced nothing but the groan of empty pipes. Another door led to what looked like a bunk room. 4 metal bed frames still bolted to the walls, their mattresses long since rotted away. A third door was sealed tight, rusted beyond any hope of opening. The bunker was bigger than it appeared from outside, a network of rooms carved into the hillside, designed to shelter a small team of soldiers through nuclear Armageddon. It had never served that purpose, probably hadn't served any purpose since the Cuban Missile Crisis sent everyone home with a sigh of relief. But it could serve a purpose now. Marcus spent the next 3 days making the bunker livable. He cleared debris from the main room, set up a proper sleeping area using the old bed frames and his collection of blankets, and organized the supplies he'd found into neat piles against the wall. He even managed to get a small fire going in a metal trash can he'd found, venting the smoke through a crack in the ceiling that led to some kind of exhaust shaft. The work felt good, purposeful. For the first time since his discharge, he had a mission, a goal, something to focus on besides the memories that haunted him. On the 4th day, he began clearing the bunk room. The debris here was thicker: old papers, rotted fabric, chunks of concrete that had crumbled from the ceiling over the decades. Marcus worked slowly, his bad leg forcing him to take frequent breaks. The winter storm had passed, but another was coming, and he wanted the space ready before it hit. It was late afternoon when he noticed it. He'd been sweeping debris from the corner of the room when his boot struck something that didn't sound right. Not the dull thud of concrete or the scrape of metal, but something hollow, resonant. Marcus knelt down, ignoring the pain in his knee, and brushed away the layer of dirt and debris covering the floor. Beneath it, he found a metal plate, maybe 3 feet square, set flush with the concrete. It was painted the same gray as the surrounding floor, designed to blend in, to be invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. His heart began to beat faster. He traced the edges of the plate with his fingers, found a seam where it met the concrete. The plate was a hatch, a cover for something below. But why would a Cold War bunker need a hidden compartment beneath its floor? The whole place was already underground. Marcus retrieved a rusty crowbar from the pile of tools he'd salvaged and worked it into the seam. The metal groaned as he applied pressure, fighting him every inch. His hands ached, his legs screamed, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. Finally, the plate shifted. He pried it up inch by inch, revealing a dark void beneath. The smell that rose from the opening was strange, not the mustiness he expected, but something cleaner, drier, preserved. Marcus shone his flashlight into the darkness and saw a ladder descending into what looked like another room below. The rungs were steel, still solid despite the years. Every instinct he had told him to be careful. This wasn't some random discovery. This was intentional, hidden, meant to be kept secret. Whatever was down there, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one found it. But Marcus Cole had stopped being careful a long time ago. Careful hadn't kept him housed. Careful hadn't fixed his leg or silenced his nightmares. Careful was for people who had something to lose. He had nothing. He swung his legs over the edge and began to descend. The ladder dropped maybe 15 feet before his boots touched solid ground. Marcus swept his flashlight in a wide arc, and what he saw made him stumble backward, his breath catching in his throat. The room was massive, far larger than anything above. It stretched maybe 50 feet in every direction, its walls lined with steel shelving and locked cabinets. The ceiling was lower here, maybe 7 feet, lined with pipes and conduits that hummed faintly with electricity that shouldn't have been possible after decades of abandonment. But that wasn't what made him freeze. In the center of the room, arranged in neat rows on heavy wooden pallets, were stacks of gold bars. Actual gold, gleaming dully in the beam of his flashlight, each bar stamped with numbers and official markings. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Marcus moved closer, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch one. It was real, cold and heavy and undeniably real. Beyond the gold, he saw more. Metal cases stacked 4 high, their locks military-grade and still intact. Filing cabinets labeled with dates from the early 1960s. A desk covered with documents that looked like they hadn't been touched since the Kennedy administration. He was standing in something impossible, a vault hidden beneath a forgotten bunker in the hills above a town that barely appeared on most maps. His legs gave out, and he sank to the cold floor, flashlight still clutched in his white-knuckled grip. The beam danced across the walls, revealing more shelves, more cases, more secrets that had been buried here for over 60 years. Marcus Cole, homeless veteran, decorated soldier, discarded and forgotten by the country he'd bled for, had just stumbled into something that would change everything. And he had absolutely no idea what to do next. For a long time, Marcus didn't move. He sat on the cold concrete floor of the vault, flashlight pointing at nothing in particular, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. Gold. He was looking at gold bars, real gold bars, the kind you saw in movies about bank heists or government conspiracies. Except this wasn't a movie, and he wasn't dreaming, and the metal was cold and solid and very, very real beneath his fingers when he finally worked up the courage to touch it again. He counted the bars on the first pallet. 12 across, 8 deep, stacked 4 high. 384 bars on that pallet alone, and there were 4 pallets visible from where he sat, with what looked like more in the shadows at the far end of the vault. Marcus wasn't an expert on gold prices, but he'd seen enough headlines to know that gold was worth something like $2,000 an ounce. Each of these bars looked like it weighed at least 20 pounds, maybe more. The math made his head spin. He forced himself to stand, his bad leg protesting as he moved deeper into the vault. The flashlight beam revealed more with each step. Cases stamped with government seals, filing cabinets marked classified, wooden crates that looked like they'd been sealed and never opened. He pried the lid off one of the crates and found stacks of paper. Bonds, from the look of them, bearer bonds with denominations he'd never seen before. Another crate contained currency, bundled cash in plastic wrapping, the bills old but preserved. A third crate held something that glittered differently than gold, gemstones, thousands of them, sorted into velvet bags by color and size. Diamonds, emeralds, rubies, things Marcus had only ever seen in jewelry store windows he could never afford to enter. His hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. He made his way to the desk at the far end of the vault and began examining the documents spread across its surface. Most were typed on official government letterhead, the print faded but still legible. Phrases jumped out at him. Emergency Reserve Fund, classified operation, congressional oversight suspended, continuity of government protocol. One document in particular caught his eye. It was a memo dated November 1962, addressed to someone called Director from an office called Special Projects Division. The subject line read, Phoenix Contingency, Final Status Report. Marcus read it slowly, his lips moving with the words. The Phoenix Contingency was established in March 1961 as a fail-safe measure in the event of nuclear attack or catastrophic government collapse. Funds, precious metals, and strategic reserves have been secured at 12 sites across the continental United States. Site 7, designated Ridgecrest Depot, contains reserve assets valued at approximately $18.3 million current valuation. All site locations have been removed from official records per presidential directive. Access is limited to Phoenix-level clearance holders. Upon completion of this memo, this site will be sealed and the entrance concealed. May God grant that these reserves are never needed. Marcus set the memo down, his heart pounding in his ears. $18.3 million. That was the value in 1962. He tried to calculate what that would be worth now, 60-some years later, but the numbers were too big, the math too complicated for his exhausted mind. He looked around the vault again, at the pallets of gold, the crates of gems, the stacks of bonds and cash. Whatever the exact figure was, it was more money than he'd ever imagined, more money than most people would ever see in a lifetime. And it had been sitting here, forgotten, beneath a crumbling bunker in the Montana hills, while he slept on streets and begged for spare change, and wondered if tomorrow was worth waking up for. The irony hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd served his country for 20 years, 3 combat tours, watched friends die in his arms, came home broken in body and spirit, only to be denied the benefits he'd been promised, shuffled through a bureaucratic nightmare that seemed designed to make him give up. And now here he was, standing in a vault full of wealth that his own government had forgotten about. Wealth that had been buried while veterans like him lived in poverty, struggled with addiction, died by suicide at a rate that would shock anyone who bothered to pay attention. Marcus sank into the chair at the desk, something cold and hard settling in his chest. This wasn't just money. This was proof. Proof that the government had resources it wasn't using, secrets it had buried rather than acknowledge. Proof that while men and women who'd sacrificed everything were being discarded, forgotten, thrown away like broken equipment, there were vaults like this sitting empty and useless beneath the ground. He sat there for a long time, thoughts churning, emotions swinging between rage and wonder and something that felt almost like hope. What was he supposed to do now? The practical soldier in him began to calculate options. He could take some of the cash, enough to get back on his feet, and walk away. No one would ever know. The vault had been here for over 60 years without being discovered. It could stay hidden for another 60. But even as he thought it, he knew he couldn't do it. Not like that. Not as a thief in the night, taking what he needed and leaving the rest to rot. This discovery meant something. It had to mean something. Otherwise, what was the point? Why had he survived Kandahar, survived the streets, survived that frozen night 2 weeks ago when the cold should have killed him? Why had he found this place of all people? Marcus didn't believe in fate. He'd seen too much random death, too much senseless suffering, to believe that the universe had any kind of plan. But standing here, in this impossible vault, he couldn't help but feel like he'd been led here for a reason. He just had to figure out what that reason was. Over the next few days, Marcus explored the vault methodically, cataloging its contents with the precision the army had drilled into him. He found a generator in a side room, miraculously still functional, powered by fuel cells that had somehow maintained their charge through the decades. When he got it running, overhead lights flickered to life throughout the vault, revealing its full scope for the first time. The inventory was staggering. 4,322 gold bars, each weighing approximately 25 pounds, 12,700 loose gemstones of various types and sizes, bearer bonds with face values in the hundreds of millions, currency in multiple denominations, some of it from nations that no longer existed, and documents, crates and crates of documents, detailing the Phoenix contingency and the shadow government that had created it. Marcus spent hours reading those documents, piecing together the story they told. The Phoenix contingency had been born from the paranoia of the early Cold War, a time when nuclear annihilation seemed not just possible but probable. A group of generals and government officials had created a secret network of hidden reserves, assets that would allow the United States to rebuild if the worst happened. 12 sites had been established across the country, each one buried, concealed, and removed from all official records. The sites were meant to be accessed only in the event of catastrophic collapse, their locations known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. But then the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, the threat of immediate nuclear war faded, and the men who had created the Phoenix contingency began to die off one by one, taking their secrets with them. According to the documents, Site 7 had been personally overseen by a brigadier general named Harold Briggs, a Cold War hardliner who had pushed for the contingency's creation. Briggs had died in 1969, officially from a heart attack, though some of the memos hinted at something more suspicious. After his death, Site 7 had simply disappeared. No one who knew about it came forward. No one who might have had access bothered to check. The vault became a ghost, buried beneath layers of secrecy and bureaucratic inertia, waiting for someone to rediscover it. Waiting for Marcus. He found himself talking to the vault sometimes, late at night, when the silence pressed too close. He told it about his service, about the friends he'd lost, about the system that had failed him. He told it about the nights when he'd considered ending it all, when the weight of his memories seemed too heavy to carry another day. And slowly an idea began to form. This money, these assets, they weren't meant to rebuild a government. They were meant to rebuild a nation. And what was a nation but its people? What was America but the men and women who served it, who sacrificed for it, who were too often forgotten by it? Marcus thought about the other veterans he'd met on the streets, the ones who couldn't get mental health care because the VA was too overwhelmed, the ones who'd lost their families because they couldn't hold down jobs, couldn't manage their anger, couldn't shake the ghosts that followed them home from war. He thought about the shelters that were always full, the programs that were always underfunded, the promises that were always broken. And he thought about $290 million sitting in a vault beneath a Montana hillside, doing nothing, helping no one, while the people who'd earned it suffered. Marcus didn't know how yet. He didn't know the legal implications or the practical challenges or any of the 1,000 obstacles that would stand in his way. But sitting in that vault, surrounded by the forgotten wealth of a forgotten program, he made a decision. He wasn't going to take this money and disappear. He was going to use it to build something that would honor the sacrifices of everyone who'd worn the uniform. Something that would make sure no veteran ever had to sleep on the streets again. It was a crazy idea, probably impossible, definitely dangerous. But Marcus Cole had already died 100 times in his mind since coming home from the war. He'd lost everything that mattered, been stripped of dignity and hope and purpose. Now, for the first time in years, he had all three. And he was going to fight for them like his life depended on it. Because maybe, just maybe, it did. The next morning, Marcus climbed out of the vault and sealed the hatch behind him. The winter sun was pale but present, casting long shadows across the bunker's concrete floor. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of what he'd discovered settle into his bones. He had a secret now, the kind of secret that changed everything. The question was what to do with it. The days that followed were the strangest of Marcus's life. He moved between two worlds now, the crumbling bunker above, where he maintained the appearance of just another homeless veteran seeking shelter, and the gleaming vault below, where he sat among impossible wealth and tried to figure out what to do with it. He'd made his decision. He wasn't going to steal the money and disappear. He wasn't going to walk away and pretend he'd never found it. He was going to use it for something bigger than himself, something that would honor every soldier who'd ever been forgotten by the country they served. But decisions and actions are different things. The space between wanting something and making it happen is filled with obstacles, and Marcus was about to discover just how many stood in his way. The first thing he needed was information. He knew what the vault contained: gold, gems, bonds, cash, documents, but he didn't understand its full story. The memos he'd found mentioned 12 sites across the country, a shadow network of hidden reserves created during the coldest years of the Cold War. What had happened to the other 11? Were they still out there, buried and forgotten like this one? Or had someone found them already, claimed them, kept them secret? And then there was General Harold Briggs, the man who'd overseen Site 7. The documents described him as a true believer, a Cold War warrior convinced that nuclear annihilation was inevitable. He'd pushed for the Phoenix contingency when others thought it paranoid. He'd personally selected the location for Site 7, supervised its construction, stocked it with enough wealth to rebuild a small nation. And then he'd died in 1969, officially from a heart attack, just 7 years after the vault was sealed. Marcus had seen enough suspicious deaths in his time to know that timing mattered. Briggs had been the only person who knew exactly where Site 7 was located. With him gone, the vault became a ghost, its existence forgotten by everyone who might have cared. Coincidence? Maybe. But Marcus didn't believe in coincidences, not when this much money was involved. He needed to learn more. And that meant venturing back into the world he'd been trying to escape. The Ridgecrest Public Library was a small brick building on Main Street, wedged between a hardware store and a diner that had seen better decades. Marcus had passed it dozens of times during his months in town, but had never gone inside. Libraries were for people with library cards, and library cards were for people with addresses. But the librarian, a middle-aged woman with grey-streaked hair and kind eyes, didn't ask for identification when he walked through the door. She just smiled and pointed him toward the computers in the back corner. "Take your time," she said. "We're open until 6. Marcus nodded his thanks and settled into one of the plastic chairs. The computer was old but functional, and within minutes he was searching for everything he could find about General Harold Briggs. The results were sparse but illuminating. Briggs had been a rising star in the Army during the 1950s, a decorated veteran of Korea who'd caught the attention of the Pentagon's power players. He'd been assigned to Strategic Command in 1959, where he'd worked on nuclear preparedness planning. The Phoenix contingency wasn't mentioned anywhere, of course. It was classified, buried, erased from the official record. But there were hints if you knew what to look for. References to continuity of government programs, mentions of strategic reserve planning, quotes from Briggs himself about the need to prepare for the unthinkable. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The world held its breath for 13 days while Kennedy and Khrushchev played nuclear chicken. When it was over, the relief was palpable. The immediate threat had passed, but Briggs hadn't been relieved. According to a newspaper profile from 1964, he'd become increasingly withdrawn after the crisis, convinced that the close call had taught the wrong lessons. He believed the Soviets would try again, that the next time there would be no peaceful resolution. His superiors disagreed. The Phoenix contingency was deemed unnecessary, its resources better spent elsewhere. Briggs was quietly reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, his warnings ignored, his life's work shelved and forgotten. And then, 5 years later, he was dead. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The official cause was cardiac arrest. Nothing suspicious, nothing unusual for a man in his 60s who'd spent decades under enormous stress. But the timing nagged at him. Briggs had died in March 1969, just 2 months after Nixon took office. A new administration, new priorities, new secrets to keep. If Briggs had become a liability, a man who knew too much about programs that were supposed to never exist, his death would have been convenient. Marcus had no proof, of course, just suspicion, just the instinct that came from years of operating in shadows where nothing was ever quite what it seemed. He printed out what he'd found and tucked the pages into his jacket. The librarian smiled at him again as he left. "Come back any time," she said. Marcus nodded, wondering if she'd be so friendly if she knew what he was carrying in his pocket, what he was hiding in the hills above her quiet little town. The next few weeks passed in a strange rhythm. Marcus continued to improve the bunker, making it more livable, more permanent. He salvaged materials from around town, discarded lumber from construction sites, old furniture left by the curb, tools that people had thrown away rather than repair. He also started taking better care of himself. He washed his clothes in the creek behind the bunker, trimmed his beard with scissors he'd found in the vault's first aid kit, even managed to scrounge a decent pair of boots from the Salvation Army donation bin. The changes were subtle, but people in Ridgecrest began to notice. The homeless veteran who'd haunted the edges of town for months was still there, but something about him seemed different. He walked with more purpose. His eyes were clearer. He looked less like a man waiting to die and more like a man who had something to live for. Marcus was careful not to draw too much attention. He didn't flash money or buy things he couldn't explain. But he couldn't hide everything, and small towns have long memories and sharp eyes. One afternoon in late January, he walked into Thompson's Gas and Feed to buy some supplies, canned food, batteries, a new flashlight to replace the one that had finally died. The owner, a heavy-set man named Walter, who'd never given Marcus a second glance before, watched him approach the counter with narrowed eyes. "You're looking better," Walter said, ringing up the items. "Feeling better," Marcus replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Found some work?" "Odd jobs here and there." Walter nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Marcus paid in cash, bills he'd taken from the vault, old enough to be unremarkable, and left without looking back. He could feel Walter's eyes on him all the way to the door. That night, Marcus sat in the vault and wondered how long he could keep this up. Every trip into town was a risk. Every purchase, every conversation, every moment in public created opportunities for people to wonder, to question, to investigate. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. But who could he trust? Who would believe a homeless veteran who claimed to have found a hidden government vault worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Who would help him without trying to take it all for themselves? The answer came to him slowly, forming out of memories he'd tried to suppress. Ruth. Her full name was Ruth Delacroix, and she was the closest thing Ridgecrest had to a saint. 73 years old, widowed twice, she ran the town's only veterans support center out of a converted church basement on the edge of town. The center wasn't much. A few cots for men who needed a warm place to sleep, a coffee pot that never stopped brewing, stacks of pamphlets about VA benefits that rarely delivered what they promised. But Ruth kept it running on sheer determination and whatever donations she could scrape together. Marcus had stayed there a few times when the weather was bad and his usual spots were taken. Ruth never preached, never judged, never asked questions he didn't want to answer. She just handed him a blanket and a cup of coffee and told him he was welcome as long as he needed. She also understood loss. Her son, Daniel, had been a Marine. 2 tours in Iraq came home decorated and destroyed. He'd struggled with the same demons Marcus knew too well. The nightmares, the anger, the feeling that the world didn't make sense anymore. The VA had put him on a waiting list for mental health treatment. 18 months later, still waiting, he'd put a gun in his mouth. Ruth had buried her only child and then channeled her grief into helping others like him. She'd been fighting for veterans ever since, writing letters to congressmen, organizing fundraisers, doing everything in her power to make sure no one else's son died waiting for help that never came. If anyone would understand what Marcus wanted to do with the money, it was her. But could he trust her with a secret this big? Could anyone be trusted with a secret this big? Marcus wrestled with the question for days, weighing the risks against the necessity. Finally, on a cold February morning, he made his decision. He walked into the Veterans Center just after 8. Ruth was there, as always, sorting through a box of donated canned goods. She looked up when he entered, and her weathered face creased into a smile. "Marcus," she said, "haven't seen you in a while. How are you holding up?" "Better," he said. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. You got a few minutes?" Ruth set down the cans and wiped her hands on her apron. Something in his tone must have caught her attention, because her eyes sharpened. "For you? Always. Let's sit." They settled into two mismatched chairs near the coffee pot. Marcus accepted a cup, even though he didn't want it, just to have something to do with his hands. "What's on your mind?" Ruth asked. Marcus took a deep breath. He'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, but now that he was here, the words seemed inadequate. "I found something," he said finally. "Something big, something that could change everything. For me, for veterans like me, for people like your son." Ruth's expression didn't change, but her eyes grew more intent. "What kind of something?" "The kind you wouldn't believe if I just told you. The kind I need to show you." Silence stretched between them. The coffee pot gurgled. Somewhere outside, a truck rumbled past. "You're being very mysterious," Ruth said finally. "I know, and I know how this sounds. Homeless guy comes in talking about finding something big, something life-changing. You probably think I've lost my mind." "I don't think that," Ruth said quietly. "I've known a lot of men who've lost their minds, Marcus. You're not one of them. You're one of the most grounded people I've ever met, which is remarkable considering what you've been through." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. "Then come with me. Let me show you what I found. And then maybe you can help me figure out what to do with it." Ruth studied him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face must have convinced her, because she nodded slowly. "Let me get my coat." The hike to the bunker took longer with Ruth. She was 73 and hadn't walked through rough terrain in years. But she didn't complain, just set a steady pace and stopped to catch her breath when she needed to. Marcus led her through the outer door, down the corridor, into the main room of the bunker. She looked around with curious eyes, taking in the old desks, the filing cabinets, the remnants of Cold War paranoia. "I've heard stories about this place," she said. "Never thought it was real." "It's real," Marcus said, "but this isn't what I wanted to show you." He led her to the bunk room, to the hidden hatch, to the ladder descending into darkness. Ruth looked down into the void and then back at him. "You're not joking," she said. "No, ma'am, I'm not." He went down first, then helped her descend. When her feet touched the floor of the vault and the overhead lights flickered on, she gasped. Marcus watched her take it in, the pallets of gold, the stacks of bonds, the crates of gems and currency. He watched the disbelief give way to shock, and the shock give way to something else, something harder to name. "My God," she whispered. "Marcus, what is this?" He told her everything. The Phoenix contingency, General Briggs, the 12 sites, the decision to hide and forget. He showed her the documents, walked her through the inventory, explained the calculations he'd done. "The total value is somewhere around $290 million, he said, give or take, depending on current market prices. Ruth sank into the chair at the desk, her face pale. $290 million. Yes, ma'am. And you found this by accident, just stumbled into it while looking for shelter from the cold. That's about the size of it. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Marcus let her process, understanding that what he was asking her to accept was almost impossible. Finally, she looked up at him. "What do you want to do with it?" Marcus had been waiting for that question. "I want to use it to help veterans, build something real, something that can make a difference. Shelters, treatment centers, job training programs, all the things the VA promises and never delivers." "That's a beautiful idea," Ruth said slowly. "But there are problems. Legal problems, for one. This money belongs to the government, technically. You can't just take it and start writing checks." "I know. That's why I need help. People who know things I don't. Lawyers, accountants, people who understand how this stuff works." And you trust me with this? Marcus met her eyes. You lost your son because the system failed him. You've spent every day since then fighting to make sure it doesn't fail anyone else. If I can't trust you, I can't trust anyone. Ruth was silent again, but something had changed in her expression. The shock was fading, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. There's someone you should talk to, she said finally. A lawyer I know in Washington. He handles military cases, benefits appeals, that sort of thing. He's one of the good ones. You think he'd help? I think if anyone can figure out how to do this legally, it's him. But Marcus, she leaned forward, her voice urgent. You need to understand what you're stepping into. Money like this, secrets like this, they attract attention. Dangerous attention. People have killed for far less. I know, Marcus said. Do you? Really? Ruth shook her head. I buried my son because the system is broken, but at least the system is just incompetent, stupid, slow. What you're talking about, exposing a secret that powerful people wanted to stay buried, that's different. That's not incompetence, that's malice. Marcus thought about General Briggs, dead of a convenient heart attack just when he'd become inconvenient. He thought about the 12 sites, all of them hidden, all of them forgotten. I know the risks, he said, but I can't walk away from this. Not after everything I've seen. Not after everything I've lost. If there's even a chance that this money can help people like me, like your son, then I have to try. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, a sad, fierce smile that reminded him of his own mother, gone now for 15 years. Then let's try, she said. What happens next will turn this soldier's nightmare into something no one could have predicted, reveal a conspiracy buried for decades, and remind us why the ones who sacrifice most are often the first to be forgotten. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The lawyer's name was Davis Mitchell, and he'd been one of Marcus's closest friends in the army. They'd served together in Afghanistan, shared a tent for 8 months, saved each other's lives more times than either could count. When Marcus was discharged and Davis decided to pursue law school on the Guy Bill, they'd promised to stay in touch. Like most promises made by soldiers leaving the service, it had faded with time and distance. Marcus had been too proud to reach out when things got bad, too ashamed to admit how far he'd fallen. And Davis had been busy building a career, fighting for veterans through the legal system instead of on the battlefield. But Ruth had his number, and she'd vouched for Marcus, and now his voice was coming through the phone in the Veterans Center, tinged with disbelief and something that sounded like concern. Let me get this straight, Davis said. You found a hidden vault from the Cold War, filled with gold and gems and bearer bonds, worth approximately $290 million. That's correct, Marcus said. And you want to use this money to build a veterans support network, legally, without going to prison. Also correct. Silence on the line. Marcus could picture Davis in his Washington office, surrounded by case files and coffee cups, running a hand through hair that was probably grayer now than it had been in Kandahar. Marcus, buddy, you know I love you like a brother, but this is insane. I know how it sounds. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you've either lost your mind or stumbled into something that's going to get you killed. Maybe both, Marcus admitted. But I'm not walking away from it. I can't. Not after everything. Another pause. Then Davis sighed. The same sigh he'd made when Marcus volunteered for point on night patrols. The same sigh that meant he knew there was no talking his friend out of something stupid. Tell me everything, Davis said, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. Marcus talked for nearly an hour. He described finding the bunker, discovering the vault, reading the documents. He walked Davis through the history of the Phoenix contingency, the 12 sites, General Briggs, and his suspicious death. He laid out his vision for what the money could do, the shelters it could build, the programs it could fund, the lives it could save. When he finished, the line was quiet for so long that Marcus thought the connection had been lost. "You still there?" he asked. "I'm here," Davis said. "I'm just processing." And you're right. This is big. Bigger than anything I've ever dealt with. There are a dozen federal agencies that would have jurisdiction over something like this, and none of them are going to be happy about a homeless veteran claiming discovery rights to a classified Cold War asset. But it's possible? Legally? Davis was quiet again, thinking. Marcus knew that silence. It was the sound of a sharp mind working through a complex problem. "There's precedent," Davis said finally. "Abandoned government property, discovery rights, finder's fees. It's complicated as hell, and we'd be breaking new ground in a lot of areas, but yeah, maybe. With the right approach, the right documentation, the right political pressure, maybe. What would we need? Everything. Every document in that vault, catalogued and authenticated. Independent appraisals of all the assets. A paper trail proving the government abandoned this property, that they're not actively looking for it. And you'd need protection, legal protection, political protection, maybe even physical protection. Once word gets out about what you've found, you're going to have a lot of people very interested in making you disappear." Marcus thought about the dark looks he'd been getting in town, the questions Walter had asked at the gas station. If people were already noticing changes in his behavior, how long before someone started digging deeper? "I'll get you the documents," he said. "Whatever you need." "It's going to take time," Davis warned. "Months, maybe years. This isn't the kind of thing that moves quickly." "I've got nothing but time." Davis laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's what I'm afraid of. Someone with time and $290 million is either going to change the world or get buried by it." "I know which one I'm aiming for." "Yeah," Davis said. "I know you do. That's what worries me." Over the following weeks, Marcus and Davis worked together to build a case. Marcus photographed every document in the vault, scanned them using a portable scanner Ruth purchased with her own savings, and sent the files to Washington through encrypted channels Davis had set up. It was slow, painstaking work. The vault contained thousands of pages of documentation, some of it so faded it was barely legible. Marcus spent hours each day in the underground chamber sorting through boxes, organizing files, trying to piece together the complete story of the Phoenix contingency. What he found was even more disturbing than he'd expected. The Phoenix contingency hadn't just been a reserve fund. It had been a shadow government in waiting, complete with designated successors, emergency powers, and plans for martial law. If nuclear war had come, the men behind the contingency would have emerged from their bunkers to take control of whatever was left. Some of the names in the documents were familiar: senators, generals, cabinet members who'd shaped American policy for decades. Others were unknown, their roles obscured by layers of classification and codenames. But one name kept appearing again and again, in contexts that made Marcus's blood run cold: Operation Blackwing. According to the documents, Blackwing had been the contingency's enforcement arm. Its mission was simple: protect the Phoenix sites at all costs, eliminate any threats to their security, and ensure that the secrets they contained never saw the light of day. The last recorded activity of Operation Blackwing was in March 1969, the same month General Briggs had died. Marcus shared his findings with Davis, who went quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You need to be careful," Davis said. "If Blackwing is still active, it's been 60 years. Everyone involved is probably dead by now." "Probably isn't definitely, and even if the original players are gone, organizations like that have a way of perpetuating themselves, passing the torch to new generations. You might have stumbled into something that's still very much alive." Marcus thought about the documents he'd found, the careful way they'd been preserved, the climate control system that still hummed in the vault after 6 decades. Someone had been maintaining this place, someone who knew it was here. "I'll be careful," he said. But careful wasn't going to be enough. He knew that now. Whatever he'd stepped into, it was bigger than him, bigger than Ruth, maybe bigger than Davis and all his legal expertise. He was a single man with a secret that powerful people had killed to protect, and sooner or later those people were going to find out he existed. It started with small things. A car he didn't recognize parked on the road near the bunker, footprints in the snow that weren't his own. The feeling of being watched when he walked through town. Marcus knew surveillance when he saw it. He'd conducted enough of it himself during his years in the army, watched enough targets without them knowing, gathered enough intelligence to understand the patterns. Someone was tracking his movements, documenting his routine, building a picture of who he was and what he was doing. The question was who. He got his answer on a cold March afternoon, 3 months after he'd first discovered the vault. He was walking through downtown Ridgecrest, heading toward Ruth's Center for their weekly meeting, when a black SUV pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and a man in an expensive suit looked out at him with eyes that held no warmth. "Marcus Cole," the man said. Marcus stopped walking but didn't approach the vehicle. "Who's asking?" "My name is Thomas Callahan. I'm a businessman with interests in this area. I was hoping we could have a conversation." "About what?" Callahan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you know." Marcus felt the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The bunker in the hills, the one you've been living in for the past few months." Callahan's smile widened. "I know all about it, Marcus. I've known about it for a very long time." Marcus's hand drifted toward the knife he kept in his boot, an old habit from his military days. "If you know about it, then you know it's just a shelter, nothing more." "Is that so?" Callahan reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. He held it up so Marcus could see. It was a picture of the vault. The pallets of gold, the stacks of bonds, the neat rows of crates. Someone had been inside. "You've been very careful," Callahan said, "but not careful enough. We've been watching that bunker for decades, waiting for someone to find what's hidden beneath it. And now you have." Marcus's mind raced. How long had they been watching? How much did they know? Who was we? "What do you want?" he asked. "That's simple. I want you to walk away. Forget what you found, leave Ridgecrest, start over somewhere else. In exchange, I'll make sure you're taken care of. A nice apartment somewhere warm. A monthly stipend. Medical care for that leg of yours. Everything you need to live comfortably for the rest of your life." Marcus stared at him. "You're offering to pay me off." "I'm offering you a way out. A good one. Better than most people in your situation ever get." Callahan's expression hardened. "The alternative is considerably less pleasant." "And the money in the vault? The $290 million? What happens to that?" Callahan shrugged. "It goes back where it belongs, to the people who put it there." "The government?" A flicker of something, amusement, contempt, crossed Callahan's face. "Let's just say, interested parties." Marcus felt a cold rage building in his chest. This man, in his expensive suit and his expensive car, thought he could buy off a veteran who'd spent years on the streets, thought he could wave some money around and make the problem disappear. "And if I say no?" Callahan's smile faded. "Then you become a problem, and we're very good at solving problems." Marcus stood very still. The knife in his boot felt heavy, but he knew better than to reach for it. Not here, not now, not in broad daylight with witnesses around. "I'll think about it," he said. "Don't think too long." Callahan handed him a business card through the window. "You have 48 hours. After that, we'll have to explore other options." The window rolled up. The SUV pulled away. Marcus watched it disappear around the corner, the business card crumpling in his fist. He'd been found. Whatever protection anonymity had offered was gone now. Callahan and whoever he worked for knew about the vault, knew about Marcus, and would stop at nothing to keep their secret buried. The question was no longer whether to fight. It was how to win. He didn't go to Ruth's center that day. Instead, he walked for hours, thinking, planning, remembering everything he'd learned about staying alive in hostile territory. Callahan had given him 48 hours. In military terms, that was an eternity. Enough time to gather intelligence, fortify positions, prepare for the assault to come. But Marcus wasn't fighting a conventional enemy. He was fighting money, power, influence, forces that couldn't be defeated with rifles and tactics. He needed a different kind of weapon. He needed the truth. That night, he climbed down into the vault and began photographing everything he hadn't already documented. Every memo, every report, every piece of evidence that showed what the Phoenix contingency really was and who had been behind it. Then he made copies, dozens of copies. He hid them in different locations, buried in the forest, stashed in a bus station locker, sent to Davis in Washington with instructions to release them if anything happened to him. By dawn, he had created a dead man's switch. If Callahan and his people made him disappear, the truth would come out anyway. The documents would go public, and whatever secrets they were protecting would be exposed. It wasn't much, but it was something. When the 48 hours expired, Marcus was waiting in the bunker's main room. He'd fortified the entrance, set up early warning systems using supplies from the vault, and prepared himself for whatever came next. The attack came just after midnight. 3 men moving through the forest with military precision. Marcus heard them before he saw them, the crack of branches, the whisper of footsteps on snow. He didn't wait for them to reach the door. He slipped out through a ventilation shaft he'd discovered during his weeks of exploration, circling around behind them while they tried to breach the entrance. What happened next was ugly. The kind of ugly that Marcus had hoped he'd left behind in Afghanistan. But training doesn't fade, and neither do the instincts that kept him alive through 3 combat tours. When it was over, 2 of the men were unconscious, and the third was zip-tied to a tree, bleeding from a wound that wouldn't kill him, but would hurt like hell. Marcus stood over him, breathing hard, his bad leg screaming in protest. "Tell Callahan something for me," he said. "Tell him I'm not walking away. Tell him whatever he's protecting, I'm going to expose it. Tell him the only way to stop me now is to kill me. And if he does that, everything I know goes public anyway." The man stared up at him with hatred in his eyes, but said nothing. Marcus left him there and disappeared into the forest. He had phone calls to make, plans to set in motion, a war to fight. Callahan had wanted him to disappear quietly. Instead, he'd created an enemy with nothing left to lose. And enemies with nothing to lose are the most dangerous kind. The night after the attack, Marcus didn't sleep. He moved through the forest like a ghost, using every skill the army had drilled into him, staying off trails, doubling back on his own tracks, watching for signs of pursuit. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. Adrenaline and purpose burned hot enough to keep the winter at bay. He'd crossed a line. There was no going back now. Callahan and whoever he worked for wouldn't send lawyers or businessmen next time. They'd send professionals, the kind who didn't leave survivors. Marcus needed to move faster than they expected. He needed to go on the offensive. By dawn, he'd made his way to a truck stop 15 miles outside of Ridgecrest. He used a payphone, one of the few left in the country, to call Davis in Washington. "They found me," Marcus said without preamble. 3 men, military-trained, came to the bunker last night. Davis's voice was sharp with concern. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal, but the situation has changed. We don't have months anymore. We might not even have weeks." Silence on the line while Davis processed. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, more focused, the voice of a man who understood that the stakes had just gotten very real. "Tell me everything," Davis said. Marcus described the encounter with Callahan, the 48-hour ultimatum, the attack. He told Davis about the dead man's switch he'd created, the copies of documents hidden in multiple locations, the message he'd sent through the wounded man. "You've backed them into a corner," Davis said. "That's dangerous. Cornered animals are unpredictable." "I know, but I didn't have a choice. They were never going to let me walk away, not really. Callahan's offer was just a way to get me somewhere quiet where they could make me disappear." "Probably," Davis agreed. "So what's the plan?" Marcus had been thinking about that during his long night in the forest. "We go public. Not with everything, not yet, but enough to make them hesitate. If the story gets out, if people know about the vault, about the Phoenix contingency, about what's really been hidden all these years, then killing me becomes a much bigger problem for them. That's risky. Once this goes public, you lose control of the narrative. Journalists, politicians, federal agencies, everyone's going to have an opinion, and most of them won't be on your side." "I know, but it's better than the alternative." Marcus paused, watching a semi-truck pull into the lot. "Can you set something up? A press conference? A leak to the right reporters? Something that gets attention?" Davis was quiet for a moment. "I know someone at the Washington Post, investigative reporter, good reputation, won't sell you out. If I bring her in, she'll want everything. Full access, exclusive story, the whole 9 yards. Give her whatever she needs." "Marcus, are you sure about this? Once it starts, there's no stopping it." Marcus thought about the men he'd fought the night before, about Callahan's cold eyes, about the documents in the vault that detailed decades of lies and corruption. He thought about his brothers who died in Kandahar, about Ruth's son who died waiting for help that never came, about all the veterans who were suffering right now while billions of dollars sat forgotten in underground vaults. "I'm sure," he said. "Then we move fast. I'll make calls today, set up a meeting for tomorrow. In the meantime, you need to get somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find you." Marcus looked around the truck stop, at the weary travelers and the flickering neon signs. "I'll figure something out." "Be careful, brother. Always." He hung up and stepped back into the cold Montana morning. The sun was just cresting the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful, the kind of dawn that made you grateful to be alive. Marcus didn't know how many more of them he'd get to see, but he intended to make each one count. The next 72 hours were a blur of movement and planning. Marcus stayed mobile, never spending more than a few hours in any one place. He used cash for everything, avoided cameras when he could, and kept his head down. Ruth helped where she could. She arranged for a friend to drive Marcus across state lines, provided supplies and a burner phone, even offered to hide him in her own home. Marcus refused that last offer. He wouldn't put her in any more danger than he already had, but her support meant more than he could express. "You're doing something important," she told him during one of their brief phone calls. "Daniel would be proud." "I hope so," Marcus said. "I just hope it works." Meanwhile, Davis was working his contacts in Washington. The reporter he'd mentioned, a woman named Catherine Banks, was hungry for the story. She'd spent 15 years covering government corruption, and the Phoenix contingency was exactly the kind of revelation that made careers. They met in a neutral location, a diner outside of Billings, chosen because it was far from Ridgecrest and had multiple exits. Marcus arrived first, scoped the place out, and positioned himself with a clear view of the door. Catherine walked in exactly on time. She was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of alert presence that came from years of dealing with dangerous sources. She spotted Marcus immediately and slid into the booth across from him. "You're the veteran," she said. It wasn't a question. "And you're the reporter." She smiled slightly. "Davis vouched for you, said you were one of the good ones, but I've been burned before by sources who turned out to be less than reliable. So before we go any further, I need you to convince me this is real." Marcus had expected that. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, copies of the most damning documents from the vault, including the original Phoenix contingency charter, the memo about General Briggs's death, and photographs of the gold and the gems. Catherine studied them for a long time, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with the hunger of a journalist who'd just found the story of a lifetime. "Where did you get these?" "From the vault. There's a bunker in the hills outside of Ridgecrest, Montana, built in 1962 as part of a classified program called the Phoenix Contingency. It was supposed to be a failsafe in case of nuclear war. Hidden reserves that could be used to rebuild the government if everything else was destroyed." "And the vault?" "Hidden beneath the bunker contains approximately $290 million in gold, gems, bearer bonds and currency, plus thousands of pages of documents detailing the contingency and everyone involved in creating it." Catherine set down the papers. "This is explosive. If it's real, and I think it is, this could bring down people at the highest levels of government." "That's the idea. And you want to give me exclusive access, in exchange for protection. Once this story goes public, the people who've been hiding it for 60 years are going to be very motivated to shut me up. I need the exposure to be so big, so public, that they can't touch me without making things worse for themselves." Catherine nodded slowly. "The cockroach strategy. Get so much light on you that they can't squash you without everyone seeing." "Exactly." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "I need to see the vault, not just photographs, the actual site. I need video, I need independent verification. I need enough evidence that no one can claim this is a hoax." Marcus had anticipated that request too. It was risky. Bringing a journalist to the bunker meant exposing its location, creating another person who could be targeted or compromised. But he didn't see another way. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow. I'll bring a cameraman, someone I trust completely. We'll document everything." "The people watching the bunker, Callahan's people, they might still be there." Catherine's smile was thin and humorless. "Then we'll give them something to watch." They arrived at the bunker the next afternoon, approaching from a different direction than Marcus usually used. Catherine had brought her cameraman, a heavy-set man named Tony, who moved with surprising quiet for his size. They also had 2 security consultants, former military, like Marcus, who'd been vetted by Davis. The bunker looked the same as always, its concrete face half hidden by brush and shadow. But Marcus noticed immediately that something had changed. The outer door, which he'd always kept carefully secured, was hanging open. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. They approached with caution, the security team taking point. Inside, the main room had been ransacked. The desks were overturned, the filing cabinets emptied, the floor covered in scattered papers and debris. Marcus's heart sank. If they'd found the vault, if they'd taken everything. He rushed to the bunk room, pushing aside the wreckage. The hidden hatch was exposed now, the metal plate pulled aside, the ladder descending into darkness. "Down there," he said to Catherine. "That's where the vault is." They climbed down one by one, Marcus going first. The lights still worked, the generator was still humming somewhere in the depths, and when the vault came into view, Marcus felt a wave of relief. It was untouched. The gold still gleamed on its pallets. The crates of gems and bonds were undisturbed. The documents on the desk remained exactly where he'd left them. "They didn't find it," he breathed. "They searched the bunker, but they never found the hatch." Catherine was already moving through the vault, her eyes wide, her voice recorder capturing every detail. "This is incredible. I've never seen anything like this." Tony set up his camera and began filming, capturing sweeping shots of the gold and the gems, close-ups of the documents, evidence that couldn't be denied or dismissed. They spent 3 hours in the vault, documenting everything. Marcus walked Catherine through the documents, explained the history of the Phoenix contingency, showed her the memos that hinted at General Briggs's murder. She asked sharp questions, probing for weaknesses in his story, looking for anything that might undermine the narrative. She found nothing. The evidence was overwhelming. "This is going to change everything," she said, as they finally prepared to leave. "You understand that, right? Once this story breaks, nothing will be the same." Marcus looked around the vault one last time. The gold that could feed families, the documents that could expose corruption, the legacy of secrets and lies that had been buried for 6 decades. "That's what I'm counting on," he said. The story broke 3 days later. Catherine Banks had kept her word. The article was thorough, devastating, and impossible to ignore. It ran on the front page of the Washington Post under the headline, "Cold War Vault Discovered. Billions in Hidden Assets Raise Questions About Government Secrecy." The response was immediate and explosive. News networks picked up the story within hours. Social media exploded with speculation and outrage. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from anything connected to the Phoenix contingency, while others demanded investigations and hearings. And just as Marcus had hoped, the attention made it impossible for Callahan and his people to act in the shadows. The first federal investigators arrived in Ridgecrest 2 days after the story broke. They came in black SUVs with government plates, flashing badges, and demanding access to the bunker. Marcus met them with Davis at his side, ready to cooperate but determined to protect his interests. The lead investigator was a woman named Special Agent Diane Foster, mid-50s, with the kind of hard stare that came from decades of dealing with liars and criminals. She wasn't impressed by Marcus's military record or his sympathetic story. She cared about one thing: the truth. "Let me be clear," she said during their first meeting. "You found federal property and failed to report it immediately. You removed documents, made copies, and leaked classified information to the press. These are serious crimes. I also uncovered evidence of a 60-year cover-up that may include murder and corruption at the highest levels of government," Marcus replied. "I think that deserves some consideration." Foster's expression didn't change. "That's not my call. My job is to investigate, gather evidence, and present findings. What happens after that is up to the Justice Department." The investigation that followed was extensive and exhausting. Teams of agents swarmed the bunker, cataloging every item in the vault, photographing every document, interviewing everyone who'd had contact with Marcus since he arrived in Ridgecrest. Marcus cooperated fully, answering every question, providing every piece of information he had. He knew his fate depended on being seen as a whistleblower, not a criminal. The more transparent he was, the better his chances. Davis worked the legal angles, filing motions and briefs that argued Marcus was protected under federal whistleblower statutes. It was an uphill battle. The laws were murky, the precedents unclear, but he fought every inch of the way. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded far beyond Marcus and the vault. The documents he'd found contained names and dates, a paper trail that led investigators to dozens of people who'd been connected to the Phoenix contingency over the decades. Some of them were dead. Others were elderly, their memories fading, their willingness to talk hampered by decades-old loyalties and fears. But a few cooperated, providing testimony that filled in the gaps in the documentary record. The picture that emerged was even uglier than Marcus had imagined. The Phoenix contingency hadn't just been a failsafe for nuclear war. It had been a shadow government in waiting, controlled by a small group of men who believed they knew better than the elected officials above them. They'd hidden billions of dollars in assets across 12 sites, created private armies to protect their secrets, and eliminated anyone who threatened to expose them. General Briggs had been their leader, the true believer who'd driven the project from the beginning. But when he'd started having doubts, when he'd begun to question whether the contingency had become more about power than protection, he'd been silenced. His heart attack had been induced, his death made to look natural. And the organization he'd created had continued without him, adapting and evolving over the decades, maintaining the hidden sites, watching and waiting for anyone who might stumble upon their secrets. Like Marcus, Thomas Callahan, it turned out, was a third-generation operative. His grandfather had been one of Briggs's original lieutenants. His father had inherited the responsibility, and Callahan himself had spent 30 years protecting the Phoenix sites, eliminating threats, keeping the secret alive. When federal agents came for him, he was already gone. His home was empty, his bank accounts drained, his identity wiped clean. He'd disappeared like a ghost, leaving behind nothing but questions. Marcus knew he was still out there somewhere, waiting. Men like Callahan didn't give up. They retreated, regrouped, and tried again. But for now, the immediate threat had passed. The investigation continued for months. Marcus spent countless hours in interviews, depositions, and meetings with lawyers. He testified before a congressional committee, telling his story to a room full of cameras and skeptical politicians. He answered the same questions over and over, never varying from the truth. Slowly, the tide began to turn in his favor. The whistleblower protections that Davis had argued for were upheld by a federal judge. The Justice Department, facing public pressure and overwhelming evidence, decided not to pursue criminal charges. And the question of what to do with the vault's contents became a matter of national debate. Some argued the assets should go directly to the Treasury, returned to the government that had created them. Others said they should be used to compensate the families of those who'd been harmed by the Phoenix contingency's crimes. Still others pointed out that Marcus, as the discoverer of abandoned federal property, was entitled to a finder's fee under existing law. The legal battle dragged on for over a year. During that time, Marcus stayed in Ridgecrest, helping Ruth at the Veterans Center, testifying when required, waiting for the system to decide his fate. He wasn't the same man who'd crawled into a bunker to escape the cold. The nightmares still came, but less often. The anger still burned, but it had a purpose now. He'd gone from being a forgotten veteran to a national figure, a symbol of what one person could accomplish when they refused to stay silent. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy, but it was meaningful. And when the final ruling came down, when a federal judge determined that Marcus was entitled to a 15% finder's fee on the recovered assets, totaling approximately $43 million, he knew exactly what he was going to do with it. The check arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a federal marshal to Ruth's Veterans Center. Marcus signed for it with hands that were steady despite the enormity of the moment. $43 million. More money than he'd ever imagined, more than he could spend in a lifetime. The kind of wealth that changed everything. He thought about Callahan's offer all those months ago, an apartment somewhere warm, a monthly stipend, medical care, a comfortable life in exchange for his silence. At the time, it had seemed like an insult. Now it seemed almost quaint, because Marcus wasn't interested in comfort. He was interested in change. He called Davis that evening, laying out his plan. "I want to create a foundation," he said. "Something permanent, something that will outlast me. A place where veterans can get the help they need. Housing, medical care, job training, mental health support, all the things the VA promises and fails to deliver." "You're talking about a major undertaking," Davis said. $43 million is a lot of money, but it won't last forever if you're not careful. "I know. That's why I want to set it up right. Proper governance, sustainable funding, partnerships with existing organizations. I want this to be something that grows, something that makes a real difference." Davis was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a warm sound that reminded Marcus of simpler times, of two soldiers sharing a tent in a war zone, dreaming about what they'd do when they got home. "You know," Davis said, "when I got that first phone call from Ruth, I thought you'd lost your mind, found a vault full of gold, wants to use it to help veterans. It sounded like a fever dream. And now? Now I think you might actually pull it off. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met, Marcus Cole. If anyone can turn $43 million into something that changes the world, it's you." Marcus smiled. I had good teachers. You had good instincts. The teachers just helped you sharpen them. They talked for another hour, laying out the framework for what would become the Briggs Monroe Veterans Foundation. The name was Marcus's idea, a tribute to the general who'd created the vault and the squad leader who'd died in Kandahar, two men who'd shaped his life in very different ways. It felt right. It felt like the beginning of something. And somewhere in the hills above Ridgecrest, in a bunker that would soon become a monument and a memorial, the ghosts of the past finally began to rest. The foundation paperwork took 3 months to finalize. Lawyers, accountants, non-profit specialists. Marcus had never imagined that giving away money could be so complicated. But Davis guided him through every step, making sure the structure was solid, the governance transparent, the mission unshakable. The Briggs Monroe Veterans Foundation was officially incorporated on a grey November morning, exactly 1 year after Marcus had first crawled into that bunker, seeking shelter from the cold. The timing felt deliberate, even though it wasn't. Some things just align themselves, as if the universe has a sense of poetry that humans can only glimpse from the corners of their eyes. Marcus stood in Ruth's Veterans Center, surrounded by the people who'd helped him survive and fight. Ruth herself, her weathered face glowing with quiet pride. Davis, who'd flown in from Washington for the occasion. Catherine Banks, who'd broken the story and was now writing a book about the whole affair, and a dozen local veterans who'd become something like family over the past year. "We're really doing this," Marcus said, staring at the incorporation documents spread across the folding table. "It's actually happening." Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder. "Of course it is. You never gave yourself a backup plan. That's the only way anything ever gets done." The first grant the foundation made was to Ruth's Center, $250,000 for renovations, new equipment, and an endowment that would keep the lights on for years to come. Ruth wept when Marcus presented the check, tears streaming down her face as she clutched it like a holy relic. "Daniel would have loved this," she whispered. "He would have loved you." Marcus hugged her, not trusting himself to speak. He thought about all the veterans he'd met on the streets, the ones who hadn't made it, the ones who'd given up because the world had given up on them first. This money couldn't bring them back, but maybe it could save the ones who were still fighting. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, the foundation was receiving applications from veterans organizations across the country, shelters seeking funding, treatment centers needing equipment, job training programs desperate for resources. The need was staggering, a reminder of just how badly the system had failed the people it was supposed to protect. Marcus couldn't help everyone. $43 million, as substantial as it seemed, was a drop in the bucket compared to the ocean of suffering. But he could help some, and every grant, every program, every life touched was a victory against the indifference that had nearly destroyed him. He hired a small staff to manage the day-to-day operations, a former VA administrator who'd quit in disgust over bureaucratic failures, a young veteran named Jessica who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan but hadn't lost her fire, and an accountant named Michael who'd spent 20 years in corporate finance before deciding he wanted to do something that mattered. Together, they built something remarkable. The foundation's headquarters was established in Ridgecrest, in a renovated building on Main Street that had once been a hardware store. Marcus insisted on staying local, on keeping the operation rooted in the community that had sheltered him when he had nothing. The town had given him a second chance. The least he could do was return the favor. And Ridgecrest began to change. The foundation brought jobs, not just the staff positions but contractors and suppliers and service providers. Veterans started relocating to the area, drawn by the programs and the sense of community. New businesses opened to serve them. The population grew for the first time in decades. The old bunker in the hills became a different kind of landmark. After the federal investigation concluded and the vault's contents were officially catalogued and removed, Marcus petitioned to have the site preserved as a memorial. The request was controversial. Some wanted the bunker demolished, its secrets buried forever. But in the end, he prevailed. The bunker was stabilized, cleaned, and opened to the public as the Phoenix Contingency Memorial. Visitors could walk through the same corridors Marcus had explored on that frozen night, descend the same ladder into the vault, and see photographs of what had been hidden there for 60 years. Educational displays told the story of the Cold War, the men who'd created the contingency, and the veteran who'd exposed their secrets. But the memorial wasn't just about history, it was about the future. Adjacent to the bunker, construction began on a new facility, the Briggs Monroe Veterans Retreat. Designed by architects who specialized in healing spaces, it would offer housing, treatment, and support for veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. The retreat would be free for those who needed it, funded by the Foundation's endowment. Marcus threw himself into the project with the same intensity he'd brought to everything since finding the vault. He reviewed blueprints, interviewed contractors, and spent hours consulting with mental health professionals about what the space should look like and feel like. He wanted it to be more than just a building. He wanted it to be a sanctuary. The construction took 18 months. During that time, Marcus lived in a small apartment above the Foundation's offices, working 16-hour days, sleeping only when exhaustion demanded it. His legs still ached, his nightmares still came, but he had purpose now, and purpose was stronger than pain. He also finally received the VA benefits he'd been fighting for since his discharge. The publicity from the vault discovery had drawn attention to his case, and the bureaucratic logjam that had blocked him for years suddenly cleared. Surgery for his knee, therapy for his PTSD, a disability rating that acknowledged everything he'd sacrificed. It all came through, years late, but finally real. Marcus wasn't bitter about the delay. He'd learned that bitterness was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than anyone else. But he was determined to make sure other veterans didn't have to wait as long, fight as hard, or suffer as much. That was the whole point. The Veterans Retreat opened on Memorial Day, 2.5 years after Marcus had first discovered the vault. The ceremony was small by design. Marcus didn't want politicians grandstanding or media circuses. Just the people who mattered: veterans, families, community members, the staff who'd worked so hard to make it happen. Ruth gave the dedication speech. Her voice was strong despite her 75 years, carrying across the gathered crowd with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to be heard. "We live in a country that asks young men and women to sacrifice everything," she said. "Their health, their peace of mind, sometimes their lives. We ask them to do this with promises of support and gratitude, and too often those promises are broken." She paused, looking out at the faces before her. This place exists because one man refused to accept broken promises. He could have taken what he found and disappeared. He could have given up the way so many have given up, the way the system practically begs you to give up. But he didn't. He fought. And because he fought, this place exists. She turned to Marcus, who stood at the edge of the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to look away. Marcus Cole is not a hero because he found a vault full of gold. He's a hero because he found something more valuable, a reason to keep going. And he turned that reason into a gift for everyone who comes after him. The applause was long and loud. Marcus felt his face burning, his throat tightening. He wasn't good at being the center of attention. He'd spent too many years invisible, too many years being told he didn't matter, but he was learning to accept it. Not for his own sake, but for the sake of the message it sent. If a homeless veteran could find purpose and make a difference, then maybe others could too. Maybe the broken ones weren't as broken as they'd been told. Maybe the forgotten ones were worth remembering after all. After the ceremony, Marcus walked through the retreat alone. The halls were quiet, the rooms still empty, waiting for the first residents who would arrive in the coming weeks. He ran his hand along the walls, feeling the fresh paint, the solid construction, the reality of what he'd built. In the main lobby, a bronze plaque had been installed near the entrance. He stopped in front of it, reading the words he'd chosen himself. For those who gave everything and were given nothing in return, you are not forgotten. Below those words, two names, General Harold Briggs, 1906 to 1969, and Sergeant First Class Jerome Monroe, 1980 to 2011. Briggs, the man who'd created the vault, whose secrets had set this whole chain of events in motion. And Monroe, Marcus's squad leader in Afghanistan, the man who'd died in the Ayad blast that had shattered Marcus's leg and changed his life forever. They'd never met each other. They'd lived in different eras, fought different wars, been shaped by different circumstances. But they were connected now. Their names linked on this plaque, in this building, in this moment. Marcus touched the bronze letters, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. "We did it," he whispered. "I don't know if you can hear me, either of you, but we did it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something Marcus couldn't name, peace maybe, or closure, or just the simple satisfaction of a promise kept. He stood there for a long time, alone with the ghosts of his past and the hopes of his future. The first residents arrived 2 weeks later. There were 12 of them in that initial group, carefully selected from a pool of hundreds of applicants. Marcus had insisted on being involved in the selection process, not to play gatekeeper, but to ensure that the people who needed help most were the ones who received it. Each of them had a story. Each of them had struggled. Each of them had reached a point where they didn't know if they could keep going. Marcus met with them individually during their first week, sitting in the common room of the retreat, listening more than talking. He didn't offer advice or platitudes, he just let them know that someone understood, that someone had been where they were, that someone believed they could find their way back. One of the residents was a young woman named Eleanor, 26 years old, a former army medic who'd served 2 tours in Syria. She'd been homeless for 8 months after a mental breakdown made it impossible to hold a job. When Marcus met her, she couldn't make eye contact, couldn't sit still, couldn't go more than a few minutes without checking the exits. He recognized all of it. He'd been there himself. "I don't know why I'm here," Eleanor said during their first conversation. "I don't know what you think you can do for me." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I found the bunker, I wasn't looking for gold. I was looking for a place to not die. That's all I wanted, just somewhere warm enough to survive another night." Elena looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "I found something I never expected," Marcus continued, "and it changed everything. But it didn't change me overnight. It took time and help and more bad days than good ones. You're not going to walk out of here fixed. That's not how it works. But you might walk out of here with a reason to keep trying, and that's enough to start." Elena didn't respond, but she came to the group sessions, participated in the therapy programs, slowly began to open up. 3 months later, she was volunteering at the front desk, helping new residents navigate their first days. 6 months after that, she was enrolled in a nursing program at the community college, supported by a foundation scholarship. She wasn't the only success story. The retreat had a remarkable track record in its first year. Over 80% of residents completing the program, over 70% finding stable housing and employment afterward. The numbers were better than almost any comparable program in the country. But Marcus didn't care about numbers. He cared about faces, names, stories. He cared about the man who'd been sleeping under bridges for 3 years and now had his own apartment. He cared about the woman who'd lost custody of her children because of her addiction and was now clean and fighting to get them back. He cared about every single person who walked through those doors looking for hope and walked out with a reason to believe. The foundation grew. Grants came in from corporations and wealthy donors who'd been moved by the story. Partnerships formed with hospitals, universities, government agencies. New programs launched: a job training initiative, a family counseling service, a legal aid clinic for veterans fighting bureaucratic battles. Marcus remained at the center of it all, not because he craved control, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. This was his purpose now, the thing he'd been looking for since that Eid went off in Kandahar and took half his leg and all of his certainty. He'd found it in the last place he'd expected. A forgotten bunker in the Montana hills, a vault full of Cold War secrets, a chance encounter with wealth that most people would have used for themselves. But Marcus wasn't most people. He never had been. Thomas Callahan was arrested in Costa Rica 18 months after he'd disappeared from the United States. Marcus got the call from Davis on a Tuesday afternoon. He was at the retreat, reviewing plans for an expansion that would add 20 more beds to the facility. The foundation had outgrown its original scope, and the waiting list for the program stretched into the hundreds. "They got him," Davis said, FBI working with Interpol. He'd been living under an assumed name in San Jose, apparently funding himself with assets he'd hidden offshore. Marcus sat down slowly, the news taking a moment to sink in. What happens now? Extradition, trial, probably prison for the rest of his life. The charges are extensive: conspiracy, fraud, accessory to murder. The evidence from the vault documents is overwhelming. Marcus thought about Callahan's cold eyes, his confident smile, the way he'd offered a payoff like he was doing Marcus a favor. He thought about the 3 men who'd attacked the bunker, the threats and intimidation, the long months of fear. "Good," he said finally. "That's good." "There's something else," Davis added. The investigation turned up information about the other Phoenix sites. Most of them were emptied decades ago, their contents absorbed back into classified budgets. But 2 of them are still intact. The FBI is moving to secure them now. "More vaults?" "Smaller than yours, but significant. Combined value probably another 150 million or so." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What's going to happen to it?" "That's the question everyone's asking. Congress is debating legislation that would direct recovered Phoenix assets to veterans programs. Your foundation is being mentioned as a potential recipient." "I don't want it for us specifically," Marcus said immediately. "There are organizations all over the country doing good work. The money should go where it's needed most." Davis laughed. "You're the only person I know who would turn down $150 million. I didn't find that vault to get rich. I found it to make a difference. There's a difference between those 2 things." "I know. That's why you're the one who found it." The legislation passed 6 months later. The recovered Phoenix assets were directed to a new federal fund for veteran services, administered by a board that included representatives from major veterans organizations. Marcus was invited to serve on the board, but declined, preferring to focus on his work in Ridgecrest. "You could have more influence," Ruth pointed out when he told her his decision. "I have enough influence," Marcus replied. "What I need is more time. There's still so much work to do here." And there was. The retreat expansion was completed, doubling its capacity. A second facility opened in Wyoming, serving veterans in the Rocky Mountain region. The foundation launched a national hotline for veterans in crisis, staffed 24 hours a day by trained counselors who understood what it meant to serve. Marcus's face appeared in newspapers and magazines, on television programs and documentary films. He gave interviews reluctantly, always steering the conversation away from himself and toward the mission. He spoke at conferences, testified before congressional committees, met with presidents and generals and celebrities who wanted to be associated with his work. Through it all, he remained grounded. He still lived in the same small apartment above the foundation offices. He still ate breakfast at the same diner every morning. He still visited Ruth every Sunday afternoon for coffee and conversation. And he still walked up to the bunker sometimes when he needed to remember where he'd started. The Phoenix Contingency Memorial had become a popular destination, drawing visitors from across the country. Tour buses wound up the mountain road, depositing crowds of curious tourists who wanted to see the vault where a fortune had been hidden for 60 years. But Marcus preferred to visit in the early mornings, before the gates opened, when the site was quiet and empty. He would stand at the entrance to the bunker, looking out over the Montana hills, watching the sun rise over the landscape that had saved his life. He thought about the night he'd arrived, half frozen and desperate, expecting nothing more than shelter from the cold. He thought about the discovery, the fear, the impossible choices he'd faced. He thought about everyone who'd helped him along the way: Ruth, Davis, Catherine, the residents of Ridgecrest, who'd embraced a stranger and given him a second chance. He thought about his brothers who hadn't made it, Monroe and the others who'd died in Kandahar, the veterans who'd succumbed to their wounds long after the battles ended, the forgotten ones who'd slipped through the cracks of a system that should have caught them. "I'm still here," he would whisper sometimes, talking to the dead because the living didn't always understand. "I'm still fighting. I hope you'd be proud." The wind would answer, cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. And Marcus would feel, just for a moment, that he wasn't alone. That the ghosts at his back were cheering him on, not haunting him. 5 years after the discovery, the Foundation held a gala to celebrate its achievements. Over 1,000 people attended, including senators, celebrities, and veterans from every branch of service. The event raised over $3 million for new programs and generated media coverage that spread the Foundation's message to millions more. Marcus gave the keynote address. He'd never been comfortable with public speaking, but he'd learned to push through the discomfort because his voice mattered, because people needed to hear the truth from someone who'd lived it. He stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, some familiar, some strange, all united by a common purpose. The lights were bright, the room was silent, and for a moment Marcus felt the weight of everything that had brought him to this point. Then he began to speak. 5 years ago, I was sleeping on the streets. I had nothing, no home, no job, no hope. I'd served my country for 20 years, been decorated for valor, watched friends die in my arms, and none of it mattered. The system that was supposed to catch me had let me fall. He paused, letting the words settle. I found a bunker in the hills of Montana. I was looking for shelter, nothing more. What I found instead was $290 million in gold, gems, and secrets that powerful people had been hiding for 60 years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even now, after all the publicity, the story still seemed impossible. I could have taken that money and disappeared. I could have bought a nice house somewhere warm, lived out my days in comfort, forgotten everything I'd been through. And honestly, some days I wanted to. Some days the weight of what I'd found felt too heavy to carry. Marcus looked down at his hands, the same hands that had turned wrenches and carried rifles and clawed through concrete to uncover secrets. But I kept thinking about my brothers, the ones who didn't make it back from Kandahar, the ones who came back but couldn't find their way, the ones who died waiting for help that never came. I thought about them, and I knew I couldn't walk away. He looked up again, his eyes sweeping across the room. This foundation exists because of them. Every program we run, every veteran we help, every life we touch, it's for them. It's for everyone who wore the uniform and was forgotten by the country they served. We've done a lot in 5 years, but we're just getting started. There are still veterans sleeping on streets tonight. There are still families struggling to survive. There are still promises being broken, still people falling through cracks, still work to be done. Marcus took a breath, feeling the old fire burning in his chest. I'm not going to stop until every veteran who needs help can get it. I'm not going to rest until no one has to crawl into a bunker to survive. I'm not going to give up, because giving up isn't what soldiers do. We fight, we endure, we take care of each other. That's what this foundation is about. Not gold or secrets or headlines. It's about taking care of each other. It's about being the safety net that catches people when they fall. It's about proving that the ones who sacrifice the most deserve more than broken promises and forgotten names. He stepped back from the podium, his voice dropping to something quieter, more personal. I don't know how many more years I have. My leg still hurts every day. The nightmares still come. But I'm going to spend whatever time I have left doing this work, fighting this fight, honoring the people who made me who I am. Because that's what they would have done for me. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous roar. People rose to their feet, not because they were supposed to, but because they couldn't help it. The sound washed over Marcus like a wave, carrying gratitude and respect and something that felt almost like love. He didn't need it. He'd never done this for applause or recognition. But in that moment, surrounded by people who believed in the same mission, he allowed himself to feel proud, not of himself, of what they'd built together. The years continued to pass. The foundation grew into one of the largest veterans organizations in the country, its programs touching hundreds of thousands of lives. Marcus remained involved, though he gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, trusting the team he'd built to carry the work forward. His health declined as he aged. The leg that had been damaged in Kandahar eventually required amputation, replaced by a prosthetic that he wore without complaint. The PTSD never fully went away, but therapy and medication made it manageable. He learned to live with his wounds, both visible and invisible. Ruth passed away at 81, peacefully in her sleep. Marcus spoke at her funeral, his voice breaking as he described the woman who'd believed in him when no one else did. The Veterans Center that bore her name, renamed the Ruth Delacroix Center for Veterans after her death, continued her work, a living monument to her legacy. Davis retired from law and moved to Ridgecrest, wanting to be closer to his old friend and the mission they'd built together. They spent long evenings on Marcus's porch, drinking coffee and telling stories. Two soldiers who'd found their way home by different paths. Eleanor, the young medic who'd been one of the retreat's first residents, became a nurse practitioner. She returned to the foundation as medical director, overseeing the health programs that helped thousands of veterans each year. When Marcus saw her in her white coat, confident and capable, he felt the pride of a father watching his child succeed. On the 10th anniversary of the Vault's discovery, the foundation dedicated a new building, the Marcus Cole Center for Veteran Leadership. It would train the next generation of advocates, the people who would carry the mission forward long after Marcus was gone. Marcus was 72 by then, white-haired and weathered, walking with a cane when his prosthetic leg gave him trouble. But his eyes were still sharp, his voice still strong, his commitment still unshakable. He cut the ribbon at the dedication ceremony, surrounded by veterans young and old, civilians who'd been moved by the mission, journalists documenting another chapter in a remarkable story. "I never wanted buildings named after me," he said in his brief remarks. "I never wanted statues or plaques or any of that stuff. What I wanted was change. What I wanted was for no veteran to ever feel as alone as I did, sleeping on streets, forgotten by the country I'd bled for." He looked at the crowd, at the faces that represented everything he'd fought for. "If this building helps make that happen, then I'm honored to have my name on it. But it's not really about me. It's about all of us. It's about what we can do when we refuse to give up on each other." The applause was warm and genuine. Marcus smiled, the expression still unfamiliar on his face, even after all these years. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the celebrations had wound down, Marcus made his way up the mountain road one last time. He walked slowly, his cane tapping against the asphalt, his breath clouding in the cold air. The Phoenix Contingency Memorial was closed for the night, but he had a key. He let himself in, moving through the familiar corridors with the ease of long practice. He descended the ladder into the vault. Empty now, its contents long since removed and distributed. But the space itself remained, preserved exactly as he'd found it, a reminder of secrets kept and promises broken, and the power of one person to change everything. Marcus sat in the chair at the desk, the same chair he'd collapsed into on that first night of discovery. The room was silent, the air still, the weight of history pressing down from every direction. He pulled a photograph from his pocket. It was old now, creased and faded, showing two young soldiers in desert fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like they had all the time in the world. Marcus on the left, Monroe on the right, taken 2 days before the IED. "We did it, Jerome," Marcus whispered. "I don't know if you can hear me wherever you are, but I wanted you to know. We did it." He sat there for a long time, alone with his memories and his ghosts. The vault had been empty for years, but it still felt sacred, still held the weight of everything it had meant. When he finally climbed back up the ladder and emerged into the cold Montana night, the stars were scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Marcus stood at the entrance to the bunker, looking up at them, feeling small and finite and strangely at peace. He'd been given a second chance that he'd never expected. He'd turned it into something that would outlast him, something that would continue helping people long after he was gone. That was more than most people got. That was enough. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the mountains. Marcus pulled his coat tighter and began the slow walk back to town, leaving the bunker behind, carrying its lessons with him. He didn't know how many more sunrises he'd get to see, but he knew that each one was a gift, a chance to do more good, to touch more lives, to honor the people who'd made him who he was. And that was all anyone could ask for. Marcus Cole passed away at 78, peacefully in his sleep, in the same apartment above the Foundation offices where he'd lived for over 15 years. The cause was heart failure, his body finally giving out after decades of accumulated damage. The funeral was held at the Veterans Retreat, the building he'd dreamed into existence. Thousands attended, filling the halls and spilling out onto the grounds. Veterans saluted, civilians wept. The flag was lowered to half-staff across Ridgecrest. Davis gave the eulogy, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "Marcus Cole was the best man I ever knew," he said. "Not because he was perfect, Lord knows he wasn't, but because he never stopped trying to be better. He never stopped fighting for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. He never stopped believing that one person could make a difference." Davis paused, looking out at the crowd. "The world is better because Marcus was in it, and even though he's gone, his work will continue. That's the legacy he leaves behind, not gold or fame or any of that, but a foundation, a mission, a community of people committed to taking care of each other. That's what Marcus would have wanted. That's what he lived for. And that's what we'll honor for the rest of our lives." After the funeral, the mourners gathered at the bunker for a final tribute. The sun was setting over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Someone had placed flowers at the entrance, wildflowers, the kind that grew in the meadows around Ridgecrest. Elena spoke on behalf of the veterans Marcus had helped. "When I came to the retreat, I was broken," she said. "I didn't think I could be fixed. Marcus didn't try to fix me. He just showed me that I wasn't alone. He showed me that someone cared, and that was enough to help me find my way back." She wiped her eyes, her voice thick with emotion. "That's what he did for all of us. He didn't have magic answers or easy solutions. He just cared. He just showed up. He just kept fighting, even when it would have been easier to give up. I'm alive today because of Marcus Cole, and I know I'm not the only one. There are thousands of us, scattered across this country, living lives we never thought we'd have because one man refused to forget us." The crowd was silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a blanket. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, someone started singing. It was an old army hymn, The kind soldiers sang around campfires in distant lands, and one by one, the veterans in the crowd joined in. The song rose into the night sky, carried by voices rough with grief and smooth with gratitude. It echoed off the bunker walls, filled the empty vault below, and drifted out across the Montana hills. Marcus Cole was gone, but his spirit remained, woven into the fabric of everything he'd built, everyone he'd touched, every life he'd changed. And as long as there were veterans who needed help, as long as there were people willing to fight for them, his legacy would endure. That's the promise the Foundation made as the last notes of the hymn faded into silence. That's the promise they intended to keep. Anyone can find purpose in the most unexpected places if they're brave enough to keep going when everything says to stop. Marcus Cole crawled into a forgotten bunker expecting to die and found instead a reason to live. He turned secrets into salvation, gold into grace, and a broken life into something that would help thousands. Because sometimes the discarded ones, the forgotten ones, the ones the world throws away, sometimes they're exactly the ones who end up changing everything. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of courage, sacrifice, and second chances. Click to march with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe no veteran should ever be forgotten.